He laughed at me in front of every man he ever respected. Called me weak. Called me a ghost of a son. But the most dangerous man in that room, a man who had survived things most people only see in nightmares, walked in, looked at my face and stopped breathing. Because he knew exactly who I was. And what I had done. And my father had absolutely no idea. If you love your parents and believe that real strength wears many faces, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. Daniel Mercer had spent 34 years trying to earn a nod from a man who gave his approval to everyone except his own son. His father, Colonel Raymond Mercer, retired United States Navy, was the kind of man who filled every room he entered with a gravitational force that made other men stand straighter. He had served 3 combat tours, earned 2 commendations, trained some of the finest special operations personnel the Navy had ever produced, and come home each time with his chest full of medals and his heart sealed behind a wall that no one, not even his own family, had ever managed to climb. Daniel grew up in that shadow. He learned early that silence was safer than conversation, that achievement meant nothing unless Raymond deemed it worthy, and that love in the Mercer household was something you had to earn through toughness, sacrifice, and a willingness to bleed for something larger than yourself. Daniel had bled, just not in the way his father recognized. He had poured every drop of himself into a different kind of war, one fought in darkness behind screens, inside the architecture of systems and satellites and encrypted signals that most people never even knew existed. But Raymond Mercer did not understand that world, and what Raymond did not understand, Raymond dismissed. The annual reunion had been a tradition for 22 years. Every October, Raymond gathered his Navy brothers at the VFW Hall on the edge of Beaumont, Texas, a wide low building with wood-paneled walls covered in photographs and flags and shadow boxes holding medals that represented entire lifetimes of sacrifice. The men who came were in their 50s and 60s mostly, broad-shouldered and gray-templed, carrying their years the way soldiers do, with a kind of quiet permanence that suggested they had already made peace with whatever the world still had left to throw at them. They drank bourbon and told stories and laughed with the ease of men who had trusted each other with their lives and never had to explain why. Daniel had been to 6 of these reunions. He had survived each one the same way he survived most things in his life, by becoming as invisible as possible, by staying on the edges of conversations, by nursing a single drink and watching the clock. He had learned that if he said the right nothing at the right moment, Raymond would leave him alone for most of the evening. And if he was lucky, he could drive the 40 minutes back to Houston feeling only mildly hollowed out rather than completely dismantled. This year felt different the moment Daniel pulled into the parking lot. He sat in his truck for a long moment, hands on the wheel, watching through the windshield as men greeted each other with the kind of embraces that only veterans share, full body and completely unselfconscious, holding on a second longer than civilians usually do. He thought about driving away. He thought about it seriously. But his mother had called him 3 times that week asking him to please come, telling him that Raymond had mentioned it in passing, which in the Mercer household was as close to an invitation as you were ever going to get. So Daniel got out of the truck. Raymond spotted him from across the room, and the expression that crossed his face was not warmth. It was the particular kind of appraisal that a man gives when he is measuring something against a standard he has already decided it cannot meet. Raymond nodded once and turned back to the men he was talking to. Daniel got himself a drink and found a spot near the end of the bar where he could see the whole room without being at the center of it. For the first hour, things were manageable. Daniel talked briefly with a few of the older men who had known him since he was a child and who greeted him with genuine affection, asking about his work, about Houston, about whether he was seeing anyone. He gave them the short, polished answers he had rehearsed for exactly these moments. The work was good. Houston was Houston. He was focused on some projects right now. They nodded and moved on, and nobody pressed too hard. Then Raymond called him over. It started casually enough. Raymond was standing with 4 men, all of them core members of the original group, men who had deployed together and shared a bond that Daniel had always observed from the outside like a child with his nose pressed against a window. Raymond introduced him with a sweep of his hand and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "This is my son Daniel," Raymond said. "The computer guy." The men laughed warmly enough, the way men laugh when they are not quite sure if something is a joke or a statement of fact. Raymond poured himself another 2 fingers of bourbon and settled into what Daniel recognized as his storytelling posture. Weight shifted back, chin slightly raised. The easy confidence of a man who had held rooms his entire life. He started talking about raising Daniel, about how he had tried to get him into wrestling in middle school and Daniel had quit after 2 weeks, about how he had taken him hunting every fall for 4 years and Daniel had never once pulled the trigger on a clean shot, always found some reason to hesitate. About the time he had enrolled Daniel in a summer JROTC program hoping it might light something in him and Daniel had spent the whole summer reading science fiction novels in the bunk and coming home talking about some story set on a space station. The men around the table laughed. Not cruelly, not exactly, but in the way that men laugh when they are inside a story that confirms something they already believed about the way the world works. Daniel stood there and felt the familiar heat crawl up the back of his neck. He kept his face still. He had gotten very good at keeping his face still. Raymond wasn't finished. He said that Daniel had gone to UT Austin and studied computer science and come out the other end working for some defense contractor that none of them had ever heard of, doing something with satellites and data systems that Raymond had tried to understand exactly once and given up on. He said it the way someone might describe a son who had become a professional cloud watcher. Technically employed. Fundamentally useless. He did not use those words. He didn't have to. The framing did the work for him. Daniel set his glass down on the bar very carefully. He looked at his father and thought about the 11 years he had spent doing work that required a level 4 security clearance and a willingness to disappear for weeks at a time without telling anyone where he was going or why. He thought about the operations he had supported from rooms that didn't officially exist, the intelligence he had built systems to gather and process and deliver in real time to people whose lives depended on the accuracy of his work. He thought about Afghanistan and Iraq and 3 other places he was still legally prohibited from naming in casual conversation. He thought about all of it and he said nothing because he could not say anything, not here, not to these men, not without violating agreements that were more serious than his pride. So he smiled tightly and picked his glass back up and endured it. The evening wore on. Raymond cycled through a few more stories, not all of them at Daniel's expense, but enough to establish a theme that the men around the table had clearly absorbed. The colonel had given everything to his country, and his country had given him a son who worked with computers and didn't hunt. It was a small tragedy wrapped in a larger pride. The men treated Daniel with a kind of distant courtesy after that, the way you treat someone you have been told is harmless. It was around 9 o'clock when the door opened and Marcus Webb walked in. Daniel heard the shift in the room before he saw the cause of it. A particular kind of attention gathered itself around the entrance, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. Men who had been deep in their own conversations paused. Raymond turned with a full open smile that Daniel had spent his entire childhood trying to earn. And there was Marcus Webb, 6'2", broad across the shoulders, moving through the room with the controlled ease of someone who had learned to make his presence as small as possible when the situation called for it and as enormous as necessary when it didn't. Marcus Webb was 39 years old and had served 12 years as a Navy SEAL before transitioning to private security consulting. He had 3 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star and a collection of other commendations that he never talked about and never wore. Raymond had taken him under his wing during Marcus's early training years, and the 2 of them had maintained a relationship that Daniel had always observed with a complicated mixture of respect and something he didn't like to examine too closely. Raymond had mentored Marcus the way he had never mentored Daniel. Had believed in him the way he had never believed in Daniel. Had told stories about Marcus at these reunions for years, holding him up as an example of what a man could become when he committed himself fully to something worth dying for. Daniel had met Marcus exactly once before, briefly, at a function in Washington 4 years ago. They had shaken hands and exchanged maybe 6 words and gone their separate ways. Daniel was fairly certain Marcus did not remember him. Raymond crossed the room and embraced Marcus with both arms, the kind of embrace he had never once given his own son. He pulled him toward the group, already launching into an introduction that was really a biography, listing Marcus's accomplishments with the pride of a man describing his own greatest achievement. Marcus accepted it with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that certain men needed to give this gift and that the kindest thing you could do was let them give it. Then Marcus looked across the room and his eyes found Daniel. The change was immediate and total. It happened in less than a second and Daniel almost missed it. But he had spent his professional life reading micro-expressions in video feeds from 12,000 feet and he caught it. Marcus Webb's entire body went still. Not rigid. Still. The way a highly trained person goes still when they have just processed information that requires a complete internal recalibration. His eyes moved from Daniel's face to his hands and back to his face, and something shifted behind them that was not quite recognition and was not quite shock but was somewhere in between. Daniel felt his heart rate change. He looked back at Marcus with his face completely neutral, giving nothing. Marcus excused himself from Raymond's side with a word and a hand on the older man's arm. He moved through the room toward Daniel with the kind of deliberate, unhurried purpose that made people get out of the way without quite knowing why they were doing it. He stopped in front of Daniel and looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to make the nearest men take notice. Then Marcus Webb, decorated Navy SEAL, Raymond Mercer's proudest achievement, extended his hand and said very quietly, "Ghost Actual." Daniel looked at him for one beat. Then he shook his hand. The two words Marcus had spoken meant nothing to anyone in that room except the two of them. Ghost Actual was a call sign. It was Daniel's call sign. It was the designation attached to the intelligence architecture that Daniel had personally designed and operated during a series of classified operations in eastern Afghanistan between 2019 and 2021. A system that provided real-time drone surveillance, signals intelligence, and encrypted tactical routing to special operations teams operating in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Daniel had built it from scratch in a windowless room in Virginia. He had run it from forward operating bases that didn't appear on any public map. He had kept it running through system failures and cyber attacks, and one particularly bad night when everything went wrong simultaneously, and he had worked for 19 consecutive hours to hold it together. Marcus Webb's team had used Ghost Actual's intelligence on 6 separate operations. On the third operation, in the Kunar province, Ghost Actual's drone feed had identified an ambush being set up along a mountain road 40 minutes before Marcus's team was scheduled to move through it. Daniel had rerouted them in real time, pushing alternative coordinates through the encrypted channel and holding the surveillance window open while they moved to the new position. The original route had been hit with an IED 12 minutes after Marcus's team cleared it. If they had followed the original plan, the casualty assessment that Daniel had run in the aftermath suggested that 4 of the 6 men would not have survived. Marcus knew this. His team had been debriefed extensively. They knew that an intelligence asset designated Ghost Actual had saved their lives that night. They had never known who Ghost Actual was. The program was classified at a level that meant the human beings behind it were essentially invisible even within the intelligence community. Daniel had never told anyone what he had done on that operation. He would not have told anyone in that room even if he could. But Marcus had seen Daniel's face. Marcus looked at Raymond with an expression that was not unkind but was completely serious and said, "The night my team should have died on a mountain road in Kunar, we didn't die because someone was watching from above and saw what we couldn't see and rerouted us in real time and held that surveillance window open for 4 hours until we were clear. We found out afterward that the original route was hit. We did the math. 4 of my 6 men don't come home if we follow the original plan. For men who have wives, who have children, who are still alive right now and coaching little league and running half marathons and arguing with their teenagers about curfew. Your son kept them alive." Raymond Mercer said nothing. One of the men at the table, a retired chief petty officer named Garland who had known Raymond for 30 years, said very slowly, "Danny did that?" Daniel looked at his drink. Marcus said, "The asset that ran that operation was classified above my clearance level for years. I got a partial read on the file 18 months ago when some of it was reviewed for an after-action analysis. I saw a photograph. I never forgot the face." He looked at Daniel. "I never forgot it because I spent a long time trying to find out who it belonged to." He paused. "I never thought I'd walk into a VFW hall in Texas and find him being called a computer guy." The way Marcus said those last 2 words was very quiet and very precise and landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Raymond Mercer had gone a color that Daniel had never seen on his father's face before. Not shame exactly. Raymond Mercer was not a man built for shame in the conventional sense. It was something more complicated than that. It was the particular expression of a man who has constructed a version of reality over a very long period of time and has just watched the foundation of it give way without warning. Daniel finally looked at his father directly. He had not planned this moment. He had not choreographed it or hoped for it or even allowed himself to imagine it in any serious way. He had simply lived his life doing the work that needed to be done and keeping his mouth shut about it because that was what the work required. He had not come to this reunion to be vindicated. He had come because his mother asked him to and because some part of him that he had not yet managed to extinguish still wanted to be in the same room as his father even when being in that room cost him something. But now he was here and Marcus Webb was standing next to him and his father's face was doing something it had never done before and Daniel felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for so long he had stopped noticing it. He did not say anything triumphant. He did not list his accomplishments or defend his choices or ask his father why the hunting stories had felt more important than the son who was standing right there. He just met Raymond's eyes and held them and let the silence do what silence does when it has enough weight behind it. It was Raymond who finally spoke. His voice was different than Daniel had ever heard it. Quieter, stripped of its performance. He said, "I didn't know." Daniel said, "I know you didn't." Raymond said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel said, "I couldn't tell you. Most of it I still can't tell you. But that's not really the question you're asking." Raymond looked at him. Daniel said, "The question is why I never told you about any of it. About the clearance. About the work. About where I actually go when I disappear for 6 weeks and you think I'm at some tech conference somewhere." And the answer is that telling you wouldn't have mattered. Because you already decided what I was. A long time ago. The room was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system was audible. Raymond Mercer, a man who had commanded men in combat, who had held his bearing through things that would have collapsed most human beings, looked at his son and for the first time in Daniel's memory did not look like a colonel. He looked like a man who had made a mistake so long ago and so consistently that it had become invisible to him, woven into the ordinary fabric of his days until it was indistinguishable from truth. Garland put his drink down and said quietly to the table, "Leave them alone for a minute, boys." And the men around the table, men who understood the weight of things that go unsaid between fathers and sons, picked up their glasses and their conversations and moved away in ones and twos without making a production of it. Marcus remained for a moment. He looked at Daniel and said, "I'm sorry it happened this way." Daniel said he wasn't. Marcus gave him a single nod and moved to join the others. Raymond and Daniel stood in a pocket of space in the middle of a room full of veterans and Raymond said, "I was wrong about you." Daniel said, "You were wrong about what you could see. You weren't wrong that I was different from what you wanted." Raymond said, "I wanted the wrong things." Daniel looked at him. Raymond said, "I'm 71 years old and I'm just now understanding that I wanted the wrong things." They stood there for a long moment. Outside the building a car passed on the highway. A group of men near the flag display started laughing at something and the sound drifted across the room like something from another world. Daniel said, "I'm not asking you to understand the work. I know you can't. I'm not even asking you to be proud of it. I'm asking you to look at me like I'm your son instead of a disappointment you're managing. That's the only thing I ever actually wanted from you. And I needed you to know that it's not too late for that. But it will be eventually." Raymond Mercer put his hand on his son's shoulder. His hand was heavy and warm and it stayed there. He did not have a speech. He did not reach for the words that would make it clean and resolved and finished. He just kept his hand on Daniel's shoulder and nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he is accepting something he cannot negotiate his way out of. Daniel did not hug him. Not yet. That was still a distance that needed to be crossed in smaller steps. But he did not move away from the hand either. He stood there and let it rest on him and breathed. Later that night, driving back to Houston on the long dark highway with the city lights gathering on the horizon, Daniel called his mother. She picked up on the second ring the way she always did, as if she had been waiting. He told her it had been an interesting night. She asked what happened. He said, "Dad and I talked. Really talked." She went quiet for a moment in the way she went quiet when she was deciding whether to cry. Then she said, "It's about time." He said, "Yeah, it is." He drove the rest of the way in silence with the window cracked and the cool October air moving through the truck and somewhere behind him. In a wood-paneled hall in Beaumont, Texas, his father was telling his brothers a different story about his son. A true one this time, and the men around him were leaning in to hear it. 3 months later, Raymond Mercer applied for a visitor's clearance to tour the facility where Daniel worked. It took 4 months to process. When it came through, Daniel drove to Beaumont and picked his father up himself. Raymond sat in the passenger seat and did not say much on the drive, which was normal. But somewhere around the halfway point he asked Daniel a question about how the drone relay systems worked, and Daniel spent the next 40 minutes explaining it in terms his father could follow, and Raymond asked good questions, careful and specific, the questions of a man who was paying close attention. When they arrived and Daniel badged them through the security checkpoint and the door clicked open to the operations floor, Raymond stopped in the entrance and looked out at the banks of screens and the teams of analysts and the layered architecture of a world he had never imagined his son inhabiting, and he stood there for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned to Daniel and said, "You built this?" Daniel said, "Most of it." Raymond nodded, looked out at it again, nodded a second time. He never used the word proud out loud that day. But he didn't have to. Daniel had learned, by then, to read the things his father could not yet say. And what Raymond Mercer could not yet say was written plainly on his face for anyone paying close enough attention to see. Daniel was paying attention. He always had been. If you love your parents and you believe that real strength takes more forms than we are ever taught to recognize, hit that subscribe button right now and show some love to the people who raised you, whatever that looked like, whatever it cost you both. And one last thing. Drop a comment below and tell us, where in this great country are you watching from tonight?